Let's jump into the today's topic of the marginal emissions factors and what does it mean to industry ecology community? How can we benefit from that discussion and progresses in that literature, and how can we contribute to that literature? So it's all about electricity. So electricity is really a symbol of modern civilization. And recently I have been working with the rural African communities on cooking technologies. And some of you know that I have been distributing the high efficiency cook stoves to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also indoor air pollutants that affect primarily women and children in rural Africa. And for those rural communities, electricity is very luxurious product that they don't really have access to. Everyone wants to have electricity. It's a clean, convenient, and it can be used for a variety of different things. That's really the beauty of electricity. And as you know, the use of electricity is expanding even further. And we've just heard that there's company, Ride Electric, that is developing the passenger airplane that is 100% electricity, and electrification of mobility, as we all know, is really exploding, not only in California, but also in many other countries. But at the same time, electricity, as we know, is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, which is about a quarter of the global greenhouse gas emissions, according to the assessment report 5 by the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. It's generated by electricity, producing electricity one way or another. It's not only greenhouse gas emissions, but also NOx emissions, SO2 emissions, particulate matter emissions. Electricity is a dominant source of those many pollutants. And also water consumption. Water is very important resource for producing thermal electricity, and it also generates heat pollution out of that. So there are, let's say, two phases of electricity. On the one hand, it's convenient, it improves the quality of life and human well-being, improves the convenience factors, and it enables a lot of things, but at the same time, it does have an impact to the environment. And we want to understand better what are the impact of electricity to our environment. And electricity is also rapidly changing. So global grid is rapidly changing because rising consumption in middle-income countries on electricity. And as many of you know, the Sustainable Development Goal includes access to electricity. Many countries, especially rural households, do not have access to adequate electricity, reliable electricity. Even those who are lucky enough to be within grid, they may have a few hours of electricity per day, and their supply may not be guaranteed. And that is the current situation. And also at the same time, variable renewable energy is rapidly expanding within our grid, and that puts a lot of uncertainty into the fate of the future electricity. And what about increasing storage, needed for supporting the variable renewable electricity? And those storage units are increasing not only at the grid level, but also at the residential level. Also large-scale electrification all around the world, and not only for the mobility, but also heating and cooling. The heating and cooling, it should be not cooking, but cooling. But cooling also, this is true. So, so there are a lot of changes in the demand side of electricity as well. And from the supplier side and transmission side, there is integration of grid going on in many parts of the world. So grid is now expanding beyond the national border in many different regions, and this is another trend that we are seeing. So the question to us, to industry ecology community, has been largely about what are the impacts of consuming electricity. Almost all life cycle assessment studies that are out there incorporates greenhouse gas emissions and other emissions from electricity one way or another, because electricity is so versatile and it's so ubiquitous in industrial processes. So we cannot avoid using electricity in our studies in industry ecology community. But understanding the impact of consuming electricity has been hampered by a number of different factors. And it has gone very far from the beginning, but not too many years ago, everybody has been using national annual average emissions factors. So what is the national annual average emissions factors? Is the total amount of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions and other emissions by electric utilities divided by per year, and then divided by total amount of electricity produced by utilities. And that has been the factor that everybody has been using for years. And then, we moved on to grid region specific annual average emissions factors like e-grid factors, for example, is still very widely used in many applications. It's widely accepted as well. And then, there has been new development on utility-specific annual average emissions factors, and grid region and interval-specific average emissions factors goes down to an hourly emissions factors and sometimes 15 minutes or 5 minutes interval emissions factors. And the reason why this is so complicated and some additional thought need to be given to this question is because, as we all know, the supply and demand of electricity by different regions dictates the amount of emissions generated by electricity. So that's why it is quite challenging for us to really understand what are the true impacts of electricity. And as we will talk about later, we can draw quite a bit of parallels, with marginal electricity emissions factors literature with, biofuel. Marginal emissions from biofuel literature, indirect land use change, etc. And we hope that we can enter into this conversation where industry ecology community traditionally has contributed a lot to the discussion. So, outside industry ecology community, largely, not exclusively, but largely was outside the industry ecology community, there has been a great progress in marginal emissions factor approaches. And today we are very lucky to be able to have a few panelists who are really well-versed and knowledgeable in this area. And the marginal emissions factors literature has also evolved in its own trajectory. So one, it was using with or without renewables, statistics, and then there was a short-run marginal emissions factors and long-run marginal emissions factors. There's quite a bit of development. I see that this development has been phenomenal. It's very interesting development from a scientific point of view, but there has been very limited interactions with the industry ecology community. So the questions that we are posing today with this panel is what are the current development in marginal emissions factor approach? And what are the convergences and divergences with the consequential LSA and other related concepts and approaches in industry ecology? And what can industry ecology community benefit from and contribute to the development? So I would like to invite not only the panelists, of course, I will ask those questions to the panelists and engender some discussion, but also the audience, you are welcome to pose any questions to this end. I will be asking these questions to our panelists, and I will just briefly go over this, but probably not now. Probably I will ask these questions when we enter into the panel discussion. So let me, without further ado, let me introduce our panel. So first, I would like to introduce Ross Koningstein, who is at Google. Ross is the engineering director emeritus at Google. He joined the Google 2000 fairly early on. He is a co-founder of Google's carbon-aware computing effort, and he co-authored What Would It Really Take to Reverse Climate Change in IEEE Spectrum, and founded the Nuclear Energy and R&D group at Google. So thank you for joining us. Jiajia Zheng is just graduated from the UC Santa Barbara with a PhD in environmental science and management. Her research covers carbon footprint of plastics, emissions reduction through data center load migration, and life cycle carbon emissions of solar plus storage system. She will join Amgen. I'm very happy that Jiajia will be joining Amgen in a few days as a senior engineer on environmental sustainability. Gavin McCormick is from WattTime. Is a leading provider of the data on the real-time and marginal emissions factors. I'm very glad to have Gavin in this conversation. While a PhD student in energy econometrics at UC Berkeley, Gavin developed the first algorithm capable of detecting marginal emissions rate of electrics in real time. Gavin then left Berkeley to found WattTime, a tech nonprofit that helps companies, cities, and utilities shift their electricity to cleaner times and places in order to reduce their emissions footprint. He also serves as electricity lead for the International Climate Trace Emissions Monitoring Coalition. So welcome to the panel. Next panelist is Brian Tarroja at the UC Irvine. Dr. Brian Tarroja is an assistant professional researcher in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering and the manager of Energy Systems Integration in the Advanced Power and Energy Program, APAP, at the University of California, Irvine. His research focuses on understanding how energy and water infrastructure respond to the deployment of emerging technologies and environmental forces such as in climate change for the purpose of improving the robustness of planning efforts for transitioning the energy infrastructure to a more sustainable configuration. So welcome. Last but not the least is Deepak Rajagopal. Deepak is an associate professor in the UCLA Institute of Environment and Sustainability and Department of Urban Planning. He holds a PhD in Energy and Resources at UC Berkeley, Master of Science degree in Agriculture and Resource Economics at UC Berkeley, and Mechanical Engineering, U of Maryland College Park, and Bachelor's degree in Mechanical Engineering, Indian Institute of Technology in Madras. He is interested in integrating concepts from behavioral and microeconomics with industry ecology and with an applied interest in renewable energy, transportation, and food systems. Great, so thank you for joining us, Deepak. So without further ado, let me first introduce our first panelist. I would like to ask Ross to give us a brief introduction on, on your work, especially Ross, you're at Google and you're really from the, user's point of view, you are using those marginal emissions factors, and we want to understand why is understanding the climate impact and also, other environmental impacts of electricity utility important to Google? And what is Google doing in this context? And what are the challenges that Google is facing? So with that, let me just shift.
I'd like to introduce this question of why does Google care deeply about stuff that goes on in the grid level? Those of you who have been following Google's environmental journey, we started by making our data centers extremely energy efficient. Then we got carbon offsets to make ourselves carbon neutral. Then we matched our electricity purchases with our total consumption so that we offset essentially the energy used with power purchase agreements. But as we go further, we want to take this a level up, and we want to look at what impact can we have on the grid, as well as develop a deeper understanding for what it takes to drive a grid to 100% carbon-free energy. So this is moving beyond the typical, buying renewable energy and putting it on the grid and not exactly knowing when or where it shows up, to saying, we're going to do a couple of things in concert, like we're going to do power purchase agreements, and we're going to try to match the energy profile of our data centers with the energy we acquire, or we're, in the case of this project that I'm with, is we're trying to match some of the usage profile of our data centers with the carbon-free energy that's available on the grid. Next slide, please. So what is carbon-aware computing? For those of you who aren't in the business, it's actually not a terribly difficult concept to explain. So where you run computing has an impact on the electricity you draw from that grid. And that, at that time, has an impact on emissions that result from the use of that electricity. In computing, you have two different options. You can move stuff around in time, or you can move it from place to place. And this requires flexibility. So if you can exploit flexibility in when and where, or even how you do computation to reduce the CO2 emissions, then you are doing carbon-aware computing. And it turns out that almost all large data center operators have some flexibility in their load. So this is an interesting thing looking forward for everybody in this space. Next slide. So let's first, a little introduction to what do we mean by computing has flexibility when it can run, because many of you are used to online web applications like YouTube or search, where the result is always there, always when you want it. But it turns out there's actually a fair amount of computation that does stuff in the background, processing videos, extracting features and training models, simulation pipelines for building more ways of dealing with interesting things that you want to build into web products. And basically, there's a lot of what are called latency tolerant workloads, things that you can put off till later because you don't actually need their results till 24 hours later. And if you do that, then you can see what we can do in the next slide here. So you can imagine the hourly usage kind of bumps up and down. But what's really interesting is if you can shape it to align more closely with when the more carbon-free energy is available on the grid. So hopefully you can see that animation nicely. And that's the kind of flexibility that we can exploit intelligently. So that is one type of carbon-aware computing. The next kind on the next slide is really when you have flexibility on where compute jobs can run. So most of us aren't really that aware of where the internet lives. It lives in data centers, and these are located throughout various parts of the continent and the world. And many of these things, like when you do a YouTube download or when you do a search, you don't actually know where it comes from. And most of the time, there's actually some flexibility in that. So if you have a particularly carbon-intense application somewhere in, I don't know, Ohio, you might want to run it somewhere cleaner in Oregon, for example, and not have that carbon penalty. Almost all web applications have these forward-facing things that have some flexibilities. Microsoft's Office Suite is certainly an example. Facebook and Twitter, definitely. Salesforce, even AWS, Azure, these are these people that offer app hosting on their own platforms. And they all have what I would call potential flexibility that they could use to do this. So Microsoft has already announced their carbon-aware Kubernetes, which is a really neat thing. And Google Cloud offers a region picker where people who run apps on Google Cloud can say, I prefer to run in regions with maybe cleaner energy. Next slide. So in this case, when we move between data centers here, you can see one data center in the back there is pretty red, and we're going to shift some load out of that one, and we're going to move it to a different data center that's more green energy. And you can see that reduced the amount of energy drawn at high carbon and more on low carbon. So this is a way that spatial shifting can be used to reduce carbon impact. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we had to scratch our head about was the carbon impact assessment. I think everybody's used to the concept of a carbon footprint, which you can compute using various industry standard ways. But it turns out this model doesn't actually work for figuring out what impact you had in shifting load. So next slide, please. To give you an idea of what we did, here's a map of Europe. You can see the relative carbon-free percentage as a color scheme. France, for example, is green because it has very low carbon energy. England, not so bad. Poland, typically kind of a little more on the red side. And you can use this as a signal to say when or where should I drive things. So this is called grid carbon intensity. And the nice thing is it's a simple proportional signal. It's either better here or now or there. And it's easy to compute using signals provided by people like WattTime from Gavin or Tomorrow Inc. And that's great because you don't want to have to reinvent that wheel. And of course, this notion seems intuitive that if an area has a low carbon footprint, you'd want to move load there. And if it has a high carbon footprint, you want to move a load away. But it turns out that this notion does not equal the CO2 emissions impact. And this is one of the reasons that we were really reticent to provide an estimate of our CO2 impact to date. But understanding this is key to measuring and then making CO2 impact reductions. Next slide, please. So again, the math is actually not that hard in this case. The CO2 impact is the emissions you added by adding load somewhere minus the emissions you avoided by not running load somewhere. And it has to be based on the ground truth. This is tied to attributable generation changes. So for example, when you put load somewhere, what generators ramped up? Can you figure that out? That is a ground truth. And when you moved load away from somewhere, what generators ramped down? And can you attribute that? And this gets into some of the challenges then, is how accurately can we estimate such CO2 impacts based on them after the fact, even knowing market conditions, capacities, et cetera. And from the point of view of a company that would like to affect change, how accurately can we predict such CO2 impact before deciding what our load profile looks like? Because our load profile at Google is fairly uniform and predictable. And so we can kind of squish it around like a sack full of fluid and make it go from something like this to something like that. And we can choose to have an optimal impact. Next slide, please. To show you just how subtle this sort of stuff is and why research here and further development is important, let's look at how shifting a load from the PJM interconnect, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, in the US, to a very clean grid up in Ontario, Canada. You can see the carbon intensity is about 1/4 up in Ontario, and you'd say that has got to be a complete win. But if you look at what historically happens, and on the right-hand side, I circled turning down of load. And what you see is that natural gas winds down a fair amount and coal winds down a bit. But then on the Ontario side, neither nuclear, nor hydro, nor solar, nor wind increase. It's natural gas that picks up the increased load there. And so effectively, we didn't really make that much of a difference by shifting load there. And so there's two, well, more than two lessons, but certainly two that we walk away with. One is that because we have global data centers, we can look at carbon-free energy everywhere, and we can say, do we have a different strategy for either dispatching more carbon-free energy or adding more that maximizes impact in any region? And the second one is, can we understand how this the dispatch and the marginal change works in order to make the best changes and to reduce the CO2 impact the most? And so that's really why Google is now interested in how these very basic things that are the interaction of physics and markets and policy work on grids.
Great. Thank you very much, Ross, for this great introduction, why this is so important. Just one quick clarifying question on this. So was this kind of Google's own experimentation to reduce the, to basically migrate the load from PJM to Ontario, and you observed this kind of drop in electricity demand and increase in production here, or was that not Google's experimentation, but the historical data?
Okay, great question. So we tend to be pretty careful about exactly what data we disclose from our operations. So this was an interesting scenario that I found a parallel for by looking at these two grids at this particular time. Yeah.
Gotcha. So, the reason why I'm asking is that, we have been, Jiajia and I have been interested in load migration and its impact. And I don't think that we have found any experimental data of like shifting loads, how does that impact on the, supply of electricity and associated emission factors. So good to know.
Yeah, I think just a side comment on that is that just like us trying to take carbon footprint and see if we could use that to do our carbon aware computing, here you learn that there are many non-intuitive things that are going on, and that's part of what makes it difficult.
Makes sense. Great. Great. So with that, is there any clarifying questions before we move on to the next panelist? Otherwise, I will close this down and I will stop sharing. So next panelist I would like to introduce is Jiajia Zheng. Particularly, it would be great, Jiajia, if you can introduce your recent work on the solar plus battery, and in that paper you review the approaches to marginal emissions factors. So it would be great if you can bring us some introduction to the literature.
Yeah, totally. Thank you, Sangwon. And thank you, Ross, for the great introduction to Google's work. I got to know Google's work on data center shifting, load shifting, and load migration during my second project in my PhD. Maybe I can touch upon on that. That's exactly when I stumbled into the marginal emission factor field. About a little bit about my work. I just recently got my PhD, like Sangwon said. During my PhD, the overarching theme is to assess the decarbonization opportunities for several rapidly growing technologies. Specifically, I looked at the carbon footprint of global plastics and then identified that the adoption of renewable energy is the crucial solution to reduce the global carbon footprint of plastics. But then it comes to the very classic problem of renewable, especially variable renewable energy, which is solar and wind, because they are so variable in nature. And how do we overcome that challenge? Especially in California, we are seeing increasing curtailment. For those of you who are not familiar, it's basically the times when supply is too much that exceeds demand. We have to cut down on our production of solar and wind. Well, it could have served useful. Instead, we just toss them away in a way. So as California is seeing increasing curtailment, I'm trying to figure out ways how we can reduce the curtailment. And then it just happened, a professor who was giving from University of Chicago, who are looking at zero carbon data centers, whose name is Andrew Chen. And that really inspired us to really kick off a project looking at how we can use load migration among data centers in different geographical locations to really match the production of solar and wind and reduce curtailment and create economic value, while also address the emission reduction issue. And that paper ended up published in June. If anyone is interested, I'm happy to provide a source. And then I moved on to study energy storage, because data center only represent a portion of the existing load, although an increasing load. But more importantly, energy storage is the most important solution that I would say in solving the curtailment or variable nature of renewable energy. So we went on to study to conduct a life cycle cost and emission analysis of residential solar plus storage systems in California. And to do that, I was looking for good source for marginal emission factors, because batteries can decide when to charge and when to discharge, or not to charge at all, just stay idling. So we built an optimization model framework, but to assess the emissions from those systems, I have to know the marginal emissions on an hourly scale. What we did is to use a full year on hourly scale for 50 or so households across California, using the so-called long-run marginal emission factors, because battery storage system will stay there for 10 years or even more, and for data centers it's potentially 50, 60 years. So in this case, we don't think the short-run operational marginal emission factors can do the job. In this case, in comparison, long-run marginal emission factors can capture the great infrastructure transformation over the next decades. It consider in those power system optimization models, which we use NREL's Campion project. They develop a model like similar in principle, try to minimize the system cost by dispatching those generators according to its marginal cost, right? And then they provide the short run and long run marginal emission factors. That's where we use it to do our analysis. But in terms of the literature, what we've found is that there are two schools of methodologies, like Sangwon mentioned. The first one is the so-called regression analysis-based marginal emission factors, which look at the historical marginal emissions, historical generation data and emission data, and regret between the change in generation and the change in emissions, and then through regression analysis to get a marginal emission factor. But the limitation of this method is that it based on historical data. Like although it's empirical data, it's very accurate, right? But it cannot inform people in some forward-looking decisions. Say if Google, let's say, wants to know if we are gonna build a new data center, where should we build it? And especially the data center is gonna be operated for like decades. And I don't think those short-run marginal emission factor based on regression analyses can inform those kind of forward-looking questions. And the other methodology is power system optimization model or mechanics model, like Sangwon mentioned, that maybe Brian will, give us a more detailed introduction to. Those kind of these are more forward-looking scenarios, right? Based on different technical, economical, environmental assumptions that can inform us with both, average or marginal emission factors that can give us foresight into far into the future. So that was like a brief introduction to the marginal emission factor studies over the last maybe 10, 20 years or so. Sangwon, feel free to add if I missed anything.
No, it was perfect. Thank you so much, Jiajia. I just wanted to mention that, Ross, during your carbon aware workshop a few days ago, you mentioned the random changes in the demand versus systematic changes in the demand. And that's exactly, I think, where we can draw the parallel between what regression analysis can help us to understand marginal emission factors versus systematic changes, such as increasing electrification of mobility or the load migration or charging pattern changes and storage increases, those kind of things. So
exactly.
I think this is very interesting, development going on. I think there are a lot of things that we want to talk about here. So thank you. Any clarifying questions to Jiajia, please? Otherwise, it's my pleasure to introduce our next panelist, Gavin. Please tell us about your work and WattTime.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So we are an environmental nonprofit that specializes in marginal emissions factors and their use to reduce emissions. I think one of the really interesting dynamics we've come across in the years is how fast this debate has changed, because a very short time ago, there was a concept, there was only a difference between marginal emissions or non-marginal emissions. And even in the last 6 months, I think we've seen a really significant change. So there has always been understanding that you can have empirical models that have all the advantages and disadvantages you just mentioned, Jiajia. And then there's also been assumption-driven models. The reason I think this is getting interesting is that we are also seeing a growth of marginal emissions models tuned for different goals. So we've already mentioned short-term and long-term here. We are now looking at predictable and unpredictable changes. Changes that are known to the grid operator or not at different times of day can actually have different emissions rates. Changes that are systematic and occur repeatedly or don't, these can all have different marginal emissions factors, and even changes of different sizes in load. If you have 500 megawatt marginal unit on the grid and you change less than 500 or more than 500 megawatts, you might actually cause a different change in emissions. Mm-hmm. So I think we've been really interested in the rapid increase in techniques to detect this. At the same time, we've been getting increasingly interested in how can you combine these structural and assumption-driven and empirical models. So we've been particularly interested in a few projects like Vibrant Clean Energy has been working on, and we think some others are going to be following, to try to say, can you conceptualize what an assumption-driven model is doing, as making a specific testable claim about the real world, that if we see quasi-random variation in electricity load doing the specific change that a model says, it's making a testable claim about how emissions should be different. In theory, that should actually be testable. So we are increasingly working on projects to say, can we not just have assumption-driven models and models that are based on regression, but can we have causally valid models that we can verify when there's a specific claim that if you take action A or B, emissions will be different? Can we have good enough ledgers and good enough quasi-random variation and eventually proper natural experiments to actually be sure those are the changes that are happening? And one of the developments that I think has been particularly interesting in this field that is just starting to happen now is that as more and more institutions are getting really interested in reducing emissions, they are actually increasingly saying, in addition to using this science, what if in this ecosystem, those actually shifting load also contributed to the science? And we're working on increasingly sophisticated systems to say, you can actually conduct randomized controlled trials as part of optimizing for emissions, and done in a proper framework with the data shared between different organizations, you can actually have a self-learning system. And so we think one of the most interesting things about electricity is because you can get information potentially as often as every 5 minutes from many, many, many power grids in the world, it takes a surprisingly small number of devices, a surprisingly small share of the time, to get very sophisticated experiments going in a way that, to my knowledge, would be very difficult to do in most fields. So the fact that electricity has near real-time data at very, very high time granularity and spatial granularity is creating an interesting dynamic where we're working with organizations that are both researchers and interested in benefiting from the best research. We think it's a really new property of the field that's kind of blurring the line between companies, academia, and nonprofits.
This is very, very exciting. In my personal opinion, I think that the integration, or let's say hybridization, between the empirical analysis, empirical models with more mechanistic models, and reconciliation of those two are really scientifically very, very interesting area. And as you mentioned, Gavin, I think that later, I hope that some of us, including Deepak, will talk about what industry ecology community has been working on, especially in the area of biofuel consequential life cycle assessment. And the one major difference here I see is that, well, for electricity sector, we are abundant with data. Of course, we are still hungry for data, but we didn't have, Deepak, in the biofuel LCA, we didn't have 5-minute interval data for biofuel production and associated reductions in gasoline production. So I think that's real advantage in electricity sector. So that is, I think, to me as a scientist, is a gold mine. A lot of interesting questions can be answered using this data, and I think we are just beginning to explore these new possibilities. It's very exciting. Thank you. Okay, with that, I would like to then move on to Brian. So how does the understanding of the core processes enhance our ability to predict the carbon implications of systematic changes to our electricity grid? And including that, please tell us about your research, Brian.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Sangwon, for inviting me. And thanks to everyone so far for talking about a lot of really interesting work. So I'll actually start with a little bit of my background and sort of where I'm approaching this topic from. My background is largely in grid modeling, but I have expanded that thematically to try and look at what are the obstacles that we may run into when we're trying to develop a decarbonized electricity system. Now, that means a lot of different things, but largely what I mean is, I think we're at the point where it's not a question of whether we can develop a decarbonized electricity system, it's a question of how, right? And the way this has been typically approached has to do with costs. There's lots of models out there that look at, okay, what's the lowest cost way to get to a zero carbon electricity system, given different assumptions, so on and so forth. But where I'm trying to approach this is that there's many more things than just cost, right? There's how robust is that pathway? What are the non-carbon implications of that pathway? What's the sensitivity of that pathway to things like climate change or other kinds of environmental forces? So when it comes to industrial ecology, what I've started working on recently, and we actually just had a paper accepted in Applied Energy on this, so hopefully that'll be out soon, is trying to endogenously integrate mechanistic models of the electric grid into life cycle analyses, right? So largely the contribution there is that life cycle analyses uses factors based on different things like regional emissions factors over different time scales, over different spatial scales. And a lot of times these are historical, right? And these embed, even if you use a regression model, they embed assumptions for how the grid was dispatched in the future, right? So Ross was talking earlier about like, okay, when you do impose a certain load on the grid or a certain, say, charging of storage or discharging of storage or different kinds of behaviors, how does that affect how the grid operates in terms of which generators turn on, whether it uses curtailment? If it does use curtailed wind and solar, is there enough to meet that load, or does that curtailment get allotted to something else, right? As a side note, one thing that's interesting from a demand standpoint is there's many end uses that base their sustainability claims on the fact that they're going to be intaking otherwise curtailed wind and solar. But if everyone is saying that, who is actually getting that, right? So those are kinds of questions that I try to look at. But anyway, back to industrial ecology. If you're trying to account for the impacts, environmental impacts on different indicators, it doesn't quite make sense if you're looking long-term to use rules or assumptions for how the grid is dispatched from historical data. Because from a mechanistic standpoint, right, modeling the dispatch of the grid through like production cost models or things like that, fundamentally, the way the grid is going to prioritize its dispatch is going to be different in the future, right? Historically, you have controllable generators like natural gas, largely in California, but could also be, coal, hydropower, nuclear, things like that. And you just kind of turn them up and down based on, which one is cheapest. In the future, with higher penetrations of wind and solar, you're going to have a very large penetration of zero marginal cost resources, supplemented by things providing not necessarily electricity generation, but reliability services or flexibility services like storage and flexible loads and things like that. So what we're trying to do is we model the grid and we develop scenarios for the far future, looking at how the grid will be dispatched. And then we try to use those mechanistic models to update or better inform the types of factors that are used in life cycle analysis, right? And the way that we've applied this recently is to energy storage, where you have the question of like, okay, you need energy storage to harness excess wind and solar, right? And increase the renewable penetration on the grid. If you deploy a unit of storage, what's the benefit of deploying that unit of storage? And that can be decomposed into a couple things. First, the benefit is having that storage in the system allows you to capture otherwise curtailed wind and solar generation that can reduce your need to use things like natural gas, right? That's a benefit. However, you're also creating a device that has embedded emissions from manufacturing and transportation and so on and so forth, right? So how does the benefit you get from using storage compare with the impacts you incur from producing and recycling it and so on? And then more importantly, how does that ratio change as you deploy more storage, right? Because one thing that we see from a grid mechanistic standpoint is when you deploy the first unit of storage, you get a lot of benefit, right? But as more storage is already deployed in the system, the later units of storage, there's not as much excess renewable generation for them to shift, but you're still linearly increasing their environmental impact. So where does that trade-off occur for different kinds of storage systems? And that's kind of what I'm interested in. Now, going back to the core process representations, a lot of it depends on the timescale, right? If you're a user with a load and you want to reduce your emissions today, marginal emissions factors can be very useful, right? And there's a lot of data. It's quick. You don't have to run crazy models and stuff like that. And that's sort of a very useful way of being able to make a near-term assessment of like how your load could impact different things, right? With historical operating rules. But if you're going to look into if you're going to plan for the far future, where you have majority generation from wind and solar supplemented by other kinds of things, right? Geothermal, hydropower, nuclear, so on and so forth. You have to think about how does the rules for what resource gets dispatched change as you start moving farther and farther into the future? And that's sort of like the capability that you need to bring into any assessment of environmental impacts. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you, Brian. This is very comprehensive introduction to your research. So I think that, to me, this kind of tension between mechanistic modeling versus more statistical regression-based modeling is really very, very interesting. And this is something that I think I would like to bring into our industry ecology community and life cycle assessment community, especially consequential modeling, which is really nice segue to our last but not the least panelist, Deepak. You have been waiting for long. Thank you, Deepak. Among many other things, Deepak has contributed to the consequential life cycle assessment literature, especially around biofuel. So what we have learned from the literature on consequential life cycle assessment of biofuel, including that of indirect land use change, in this discussion, Deepak?
I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much, Sangwon. I really appreciate the invitation to be part of this really exciting group. So just one thing before I jump in, that on the frequency of data, it's all relative. When I came to do a PhD in 2004, I really wanted to study biofuel producing trees, non-edible oil crops from perennial trees, because perennials are more sustainable. But then I figured, if I were to do a PhD in 5 years, if I plant something, it's not going to grow for 8 years. So there won't be even a single data point. And so, not that I was planning to, but so I shifted to studying corn biofuel, which grows in 4 months. And so there's a lot more you can comment on. So, data, availability of data is very relative for us. But if you don't mind, I'll just share just a couple of slides, partially because of my accent and just to give some clarity. Just wanted to share, sorry, just 3 slides. Sorry, the animation is out. So I see, just to take away what I learned from the consequential LCA work, I'm interested in the methodological side of consequential LCA as to how we can, am I interested in using simple conceptual tools to illustrate an important point rather than actually producing numbers for concretely concluding whether one product is better or the other. So I see 2 broad questions motivating LCA. Again, this is my view. Again, this is not a universal view. It's a very evolving landscape, like Sangwon said. And we have been part of many discussions with Sangwon on how people see consequential LCA. There are different interpretations of it. But from a policy perspective, I see 2 useful categorizations. One is like, how does a unit of a product compare with a unit of product B at a given point in time? I see this as some of the more traditional applications of life cycle assessment, and I see this as a relevant question in the short run and a small scale. And so you're looking at the average or the marginal, but even the concept of marginal is simpler when you're talking of a question like this. But if you ask a question, what will be the environmental impact of a 1,000-fold increase in the consumption of a product A? So we have heard about batteries, storage, solar, any new technology. We are often comparing life cycle assessment to compare how a new technology, new process, new methodology, new way of doing things, if it scales up, what is its benefits? And that's, for me, the more interesting question from a public policy perspective as to how do we use life cycle assessment and industrial ecology to sort of guide nurture the evolution of a technology. So it's more a longer run question. We're asking about what will happen over a period of time, not instantaneously. So you can change capital, you can change behavior. Everything is like is fluid. It's not like fixed or given. You can change capital, and so that brings in a lot of interesting things about what does it mean to talk about marginal in the long run. Right? I see marginal as well defined and easily understood in a short run concept, but in the long run, what is the kind of investments we are not doing is the question we are asking, more than what we will be dispatching 20 years from now, right? I mean, it's more like what kind of investments are we making that will represent the marginal resource. So again, I think we need as a community, we need to be clear about what is the question we are asking. So that's one thing I wanted to put out there. And just very briefly, I'm not going to, in the interest of time, not do the whole animation, but just what are we talking about in consequential LCA? So just to give a simple example of what I have studied, is this a plausible causal? I say plausible because it is subject to verification, and we know life cycle assessment, it's very hard to verify. It's not like something, a very well-defined system where we can verify something either through an experiment in a lab or by collecting statistical data. So both those traditional ways of verifying claims is not available to us. So we have to be very careful when we as industrial ecologists put out claims about the impact of biofuels or electric vehicles in the longer run over a 10-year, 15-year period on a large scale. So just to give a brief example, like what type of causal impacts or causal chain we are trying to trace in electricity based on what we learned from biofuel. Like, so this is the question that we grappled with in biofuels is, government mandates increase the demand for corn, or in the case of Brazil, you can take sugarcane and substitute sugarcane there. That leads to the diversion of corn for ethanol and away from corn for food and animal feed. That raises corn prices. Farmers then allocate more land to corn because it's more profitable, and they allocate less land for soybean and wheat, which it competes with. And then that increases the price of soy and wheat because now that land has gone to corn, which raises the price of, which makes farmers to allocate in some other countries to look at, because they see an opportunity because US is producing less soy and less wheat. So they allocate more land to now soy and wheat and less land to other profitable crops. It may be sugarcane or it may be hay or pasture. And then those prices trickle down and they will say, okay, now we need more land for hay and pasture for livestock, and that will go to lead to clearing of forest land for pasture. So this is the type of things, causal chains that people have been trying to model. A lot of it was done by microeconomists, trade people. And so there's been a lot of cross-fertilization from of interaction of LCA people, LCA community, the industrial ecology community with mainly agricultural economists, in this example. So it is a very interesting interdisciplinary sort of area for research. And as you go down, you increase the scope and complexity. So just 5 takeaways, and then I will stop. What we have learned, I think there is the whole meaning of the word indirect emissions has taken a new meaning. In LCA, we always, when we teach LCA, we talk about direct and indirect, but this is like a new meaning of indirect. It's not something just associated with what you produce. It's also like, what are the impacts of what I produce? How does it impact markets? How does it impact prices? How does it impact behavior? How does it impact investment? It expanded the scope of indirect emissions big time and brought in, made things more difficult for us from a modeling perspective. And that means it's more comprehensive, but it increases the uncertainty in the numbers because the things that I mentioned make a lot more, require a lot more assumptions and behavioral assumptions and so on and so forth. And then what this also means is that the benefits of a technology cannot be taken as given. A lot of times, I think we in the life cycle community or the industrial ecology community produce numbers that we seem to at least convey, or people, we don't do a good enough job of communicating that these are numbers at a given point in time, or these are not numbers that you can take as given. So something looks cleaner than something. So let's go make a policy towards favoring that policy. That is not the way to approach it, because once you make a policy, the future will be very different. People will adapt and behave differently, and so you may not actually get the gains you intended to capture. And so I want to just conclude saying that it's very useful, the whole expansion of LCA system boundary to include include indirect emissions is useful, but we have to be very careful because we have to use the numbers very carefully. We have to be very clear what is the scope, what is the uncertainty, what is the time frame, and so on. And just one thing in the is that I think we talk a lot about Jiajia emissions from in the indirect emissions and even when you talk of new technologies, but we have not focused sufficiently on other types of burdens, including social impacts. So those are my 5 takeaways, and I'll stop sharing.
Great. Thank you,
what we
Deepak,
learned.
for your introduction to your thoughts. And I think it's really fascinating that, understanding the environmental impact of biofuel really required, multiple disciplines. In the literature, you talked about, economics and also behavioral science, and obviously there's engineering also going on, and industry, ecology, and life cycle assessment community is really embracing those, research into, life cycle assessment of biofuel. And that also, I think, draws really nice parallel with what Ross has introduced at the beginning, where, load has been migrated from one data center to another, expecting that we are harnessing the abundant renewable energy in another grid, but maybe the marginal impact of that load migration might be something else than what the average of that grid mix really represents. So there are a lot of unexpected, unintended consequences in the way how the technological system behaves, and I think we really need multiple disciplines working together to really tackle these complex problems. So now we have a round of introductions by all of our panel members, and I would like to begin, our conversation with the, question posed to all panel members, which is that, what do you think is the main challenges still remaining in understanding the impact of electricity under the rapidly changing the grid and all the approaches that we talked about? But from your point of view, what are the remaining challenges that we need to tackle together?
Happy to start as a consumer of the information. I think Gavin pointed out that there's one of the wonderful things that can be done is live experimentation. Google has data centers all over the world, and our carbon-aware computing is intended to work with all forms of carbon-free energy. So in some places you've got geothermal, in other places you've got a lot of hydro, other places you have solar and wind, other places you have nuclear. Each of these has their own type of strategy for dealing with dispatch, or how do you get more out of a particular form of carbon-free energy. And so being able to do experiments is actually very, very useful, I think, both as a consumer of the information, as well as making this more available to more players in the industry. And this notion that we don't actually have a model that works, but can we work together to create one that's at least directionally correct to start? We don't have to be perfect, but can we have more certainty that we're doing good in general? And then can we refine this over time and build understanding? So it's actually really great to see the development of this in academia and in this field.
Great. Thank you, Ross. So just for those who joined later after we start, so we are talking about the really great and interesting progress that are being made in the marginal emissions factors literature, and how can we learn from this interesting development in marginal emissions factor literature, and also how can we contribute to the development of this marginal emissions factor literature. So we have brought in the speakers and panelists from industry and academia, including Google, WattTime, UC Irvine, UCLA, and UCSB. We are talking about first question, what are the key challenges and how can we overcome? And Ross just talked about the capability for us to be able to do the experimentation is really, helping us to have a better understanding. And to that end, I would like to kind of challenge that response with the flavor of what Brian just talked about, which is that, even if we can do experimentation, we are inherently limited by the circumstances under which that experimentation is conducted, right? So we cannot do an experimentation where the 80% of the grid is renewable, and battery storage is 200 times larger than today, because our current situation where we can do the experiment is fundamentally different from the future grid and how the supply and demand of electricity will be made in the future. So how would you respond to that? I think I can also, go back to Gavin. Gavin, if you would like to, respond to that, that would be also great, given that you are already using those kind of experimental data and trying to bridge those two different approaches, please.
Certainly be interested to say, I think experiments are fantastic. One other thing is sometimes you can have as good as random variation. So there's been some interesting research. If somebody scores a goal early in a soccer match and they go to commercial early and a large number of people apparently put on a kettle of tea, you've been able to see the randomness of when that goal happened is as good as an experiment of randomized change in mode. So there are some of these quasi-random experiments happening now, many more that can be done soon. And I think what we are very interested in the assumption-driven models, if you are thinking about the future, how can we do something like experiments for our assumptions? So Sierra Club did some very interesting research saying models that assume that power grids operate as efficiently as possible actually don't hold up very well, because there's a very consistent pattern that a lot of electricity utilities are not interested in making costs as small as possible. They're making them as high as possible. But you can imagine dynamics like that might be the kind of thing you could use scientific experiments to determine what are the patterns in the power grid that may not change. And you might be able to say, can we be using those assumptions in our models to think about how the grid could be different in the future, since you can't run experiments in the distant future.
Very interesting. Yeah. And Brian, how would you, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just want to add to that. And I think Ross and Gavin gave a pretty good overview. I don't see this as necessarily being in conflict, the experimentation and sort of like the future stuff. You sort of just have to know, you have to know what it is that you can translate, right? So the thing is, as you said, if you run experiments and if you just take the results of a current day experiment, it may not be translatable into the future, but that's not what we're proposing to do, is just like, oh, just run experiments and take the results. The key thing behind all of this is trying to understand what are the driving factors for certain kinds of behavior, right? And the benefit of having present day experiments is that there's a lot of data out there that you can draw upon to show that, hey, these types of factors drive certain kinds of behaviors, right? And then moving into the future, what you would do is you would just kind of as a thought exercise, and you can do this in the modeling space through scenario analysis, is, how persistent are those linkages, right, going into the future? And that's not going to be an exact scientific process, because whenever you're talking about future projections, right, you're always like kind of guessing, right? No one can say like 20 years from now, this is exactly how they're going to, like, I don't know, meet grid reserves or whatever. But you have some ideas, you have some based on a mechanistic understanding of the system, and combined with understanding of current data, you can make some guesses as to how they might do it, and you can test them. Well, I don't know if I want to say test the right word, but you can sort of study the spread of impacts based on assumptions for whether certain of those linkages hold or whether they change to something else, right? So, and I think that's important to translate into policy too, because as Deepak said, like with industrial ecology, you don't want to just like do an experiment, get some data, and then tell a policymaker like, oh, this is like the truth and you should plan everything around it, right? But at the same time, for policy, you need to have some kind of certainty. You can't just go to a policymaker and be like, well, there's 200 different scenarios and they all behave 200 different, like, so I feel like this getting to the base of it, which is understanding what are the driving factors and what happens if certain things persist or if they don't, is important for policymakers, because it allows them to design policies that are flexible and that can adapt or jump between different pathways as we move forward in time. And it's kind of in the class I teach on sustainable energy systems, I always tell the students that, we're really bad at predicting the future, right? So, and that's true, right? I mean, no matter how many degrees or how how much of an expert you are, like, we're really bad at predicting the future. But, and the other thing too, is that the future, that's not set in stone, right? If you're talking about what's going to happen 20 years from now, it's not like there's some fundamental, law that's going to dictate how our system is going to evolve. That's going to be based on the choices that we make, right? So having an understanding of how the choices we make affects what trajectory we take, I think is key. And that's how you combine like the experimental understanding with a lot of like the scenario analysis type stuff moving into the future.
Yeah, I think what Brian just said reminds me that I've heard that it was what Yogi Berra said, that prediction is hard, especially if it is about the future.
Yeah,
I think
it's
that
true. Yeah.
What Ross has said, which is that, well, if we can get directionally correct, projections, directionally correct, not probably magnitude correct, but directionally correct projections, I think that serves, at least a good basis for a decision. Of course, we cannot just directionally correct, and we want to improve our ability to, estimate the magnitude as well. But what do you think, Deepak? Would you?
I think I agree with that on the experimentation, because I'm always, as an academic, saying we need to do more, there has to be more learning and we have to model. But one thing I will also say we can learn from the biofuel experiences, where we try to do a lot of modeling and come up with a number, and then we added that number. So if you corn ethanol, which is the US main biofuel, we did these models, people produced some numbers, and then they stuck that number along with the supply chain of corn ethanol and said, now when you add these indirect effects in corn ethanol's own supply chain, it's dirtier than gasoline. And there was huge uncertainty depending on and that essentially meant you had to ban corn ethanol, which is sort of the kind of thing we try to do in California. So I think we have to take a more nuanced approach, where essentially we say that, okay, the first billion gallons, so in this case, the first 1 terawatt hours, we are going to use it as a learning exercise. We are not going to regulate every unit of emissions for greenhouse gases, because it's primarily meant for learning. And then after 1 terawatt hours, we can take a call and see whether what we learned. And so I guess we should use this. I guess how we use these numbers is also very important. Are we using it to pick a number, or just to get some broad learning going in the industry?
I agree. I think on that end, I think Jiajia probably can share something about what we have been working on.
Yeah, that's what I have observed. The reason why we are having this conversation is because it's still very nascent field, right? Why we are talking about the industry can, take the lead in doing some natural experiments by playing around data center shifts and loading, etc. While, the modelers, we, sort of in the academia kind of play around parameters and set different scenarios. My answer to this is like, we need both, we need to do them in parallel, and to convene like activities like this is perfect. And getting back to your original question, I think one of the challenges is that why modeling marginal emitter factor is difficult is because, first of all, it's very hard to identify the generator which is on the margin, right? That problem itself is already difficult, and now we have different tools and methodologies. So my thinking is that going forward, we kind of need to convene and try to standardize a little bit. Well, if we cannot put up a standard, then at least we should categorize the methodology. And, as we go, we kind of figuring the way out. And I was personally involved in a workshop from IEEE, those electric engineers coming together, try to come up with a marginal emission factor standard to, guide through the ICT sector. Probably not provide the source, but like to come up with a methodology framework to get the word out, to make more people aware of marginal emission factors and why is it so relevant, so important to, decarbonization or sustainability initiatives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Jiajia. And one thing that I would like to allude to in that regard is that, one of the papers that Jiajia worked on was what is the effect of adding storage to PV, rooftop PV? And answering that question was quite complicated, because depending on how users behave. So for example, suppose that, you are subscribed to time of use rates. And if you have a battery, then, electricity rate is the lowest at night when the grid is the dirtiest. And then, you are charging, you can charge your battery using, coal and oil power plant generated electricity and discharge it it during the daytime when you're using air conditioner, for example. And depending on how users behave and depending on the accounting framework that we are calculating this greenhouse gas emissions by adding storage unit, the impact, the result can be vastly different. And it goes back to what Deepak just mentioned, that, well, biofuel in some cases is shown to be worse than gasoline, that has an impact on the policy decisions out of it. Another thing that I would like to also mention is that there is a phenomenal development in the economics literature on causal inference analysis over the last decade or so. And definitely we as a community in industry ecology should benefit from this phenomenal development in causal inference analysis. And I believe that the abundance of data in electric power utility sector also gives a lot of good basis for using this causal inference analysis going forward. So with that, I would like to kind of shift the gear to the last question. We don't have a lot of time. Probably we have about 5 minutes of time. We have covered all other questions, but the last one that I would like to focus on for the last 5 minutes is, how can we engender, collaboration and communication between these, let's say, communities of researchers. And, today among our panelists, we have marginal emissions factors of electricity researchers and industry ecology community, as well as we have, power integration and, electric power utility core processes understanding and those, research. And so we have multiple different, communities and disciplines around this table. So how can we, work together to solve these grand challenges in our understanding of environmental impact, as important as electricity? And if we fail to understand the environmental impact of electricity, then we will not be able to understand, many other, technologies impact, right? So we all know how ubiquitous and important the electricity is, and it's really, I think, a paramount challenge for industry ecology community and life cycle assessment community to better understand the environmental impact of electric utility, and for which I think we need to work together. And the question is, how can we engender that, communication, cross-fertilization and conversation amongst ourselves? So what is your view on that? And at this point, I would like to also invite our audience. I mean, we have not too huge, audience today. So if you'd like to, contribute to this discussion, please feel free to unmute yourself and tell us about your thoughts. So I see that Yuich, welcome Yuich, joining the meeting. So Yuich just entered the chat box. Do you think is there institutional difference to consider between the US and other regions or within the US among states when discussing the issue of marginal emissions factors, e.g. governmental intervention to connection of renewables to main grid? So, Yuich, you are still here, right? Let me see.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, great. Yeah, so Yuich, so feel free to elaborate a little further. Good morning. Yes.
Good morning. Okay, thank you, Sangwon, for giving me opportunity to speak up. And I really appreciate you organize this very interesting session, because I personally have been involved in Japanese discussion on the government, mainly led by Resource and Energy Agency, and the not necessarily marginal, but provider specific emission factors that is officially determined by the government, and it is used for the indirect emission of users in the industries. So when we had a discussion, for example, how to consider the renewables provided by feed-in tariff scheme, but the government is a bit reluctant to to include the influence of the renewables because the cost was shared by all users. So even if the specific providers provide more renewables, but more in the average schemes has been used. So I felt the rather reluctancy to consider marginality of electricity rather than the stability of electricity, because when, as you know, if renewable penetrate rapidly, stability of grid will disappear, and the cost should be borne by the traditional providers. And such a discussion, I think the Japanese system is very, very solid, where sometimes we locked into the traditional thinking. So that's why I think that the US could be the opposite. In particular, West Coast could be the opposite side. So I want to learn a lot from your experiences. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ich. I believe that some of our panel can share their insight. And, California, about a month and a half ago, we reached for the first time 94.5% renewable in a grid at brief amount of period of time. So I'm very proud that, renewable energy has penetrated really significantly in California. But I do see, even in California and other states in the United States, I think there is a bit of reluctance indeed by the utility operators, grid operators on the rising uncontrollable feed-in electricity from renewables, from rooftop solar, etc. So this is definitely an issue not only in Japan but also in other countries. So Brian or others, can you share some thoughts about, how the integration of, those discrete sources of renewable in the United States are viewed by the utility providers?
Yeah, so the first answer I'm going to give is that even within the US, it varies significantly from utility to utility, right? So on the West Coast, the utilities tend to be a little bit more progressive. They weren't initially, but I think nowadays they're starting to be a bit more progressive, largely because they're influenced by state policy and largely because their customers want it, right? In other parts of the US, you're going to run into similar kinds of issues where they're very resistant to, allowing interconnection of distributed energy resources and storage and things like that, because politically they want to maintain their current trajectory, or they don't want to have the costs associated with upgrading the system to accommodate these resources, or they just are not interested in, in DERs for political reasons or things like that. So as far as whether there's institutional differences between the US and other regions, there probably is, but even within the US, it varies quite a bit. If you talk to what the political landscape is for getting DERs and, say solar and storage integrated in California, that's going to be very different than, say, like the South, right? Just because politically they have different priorities. And I think that's in itself as a statement, is that every time you go to every particular region, they're going to have their own set of priorities. And then how do you work with regions that have different priorities to sort of arrive at more or less a similar kind of goal, right? There's no general answer to that question, but that's what we're gonna have to run into.
Exactly. Yeah. Like just look at Texas. Even after experiencing that, blackouts, still they don't want to integrate with other regions. We just hear from Heinz, our president of our society, sharing the experience in Canberra in Australia. So Heinz.
Sangwon, past president, to be correct, since 1st of April, luckily. No, I mean, just joking. You may have met Simon Corbell, Sangwon, at the Gordon conference in Vermont. Yep. He single-handedly organized to purchase 3 wind farms and 2 solar farms through reverse auction, and achieved through this within 3 years to make Canberra electricity generation in Canberra carbon neutral. So it's all renewable. He then lost a pre-selection as a result of his own party, who thought that was not a great achievement. Which is really sad, because when you step out, often that has negative consequences for your political future. But nevertheless, we are not using any fossil fuel in Canberra for electricity generation for a number of years now.
Yeah, but is that reverse auction open to the individual household level, or utility providers and renewable energy?
No, this was large scale.
Okay, large scale provider. Yeah, okay, gotcha. That makes sense. Great. I see Keisuke, entered his comments on chat box. Would you, unmute your microphone, Keisuke, and elaborate your question?
Yeah. Thank you for the giving a chance to have a question here. So as you said, the progress of the new renewable energy in Japan is very slow. Therefore, the penetration rate is not enough to consider the unstable situation electricity provide. But and in the US, I think that in order to achieve almost 100% renewable energy, or if US want to export energy, renewable energy to other country, which means the 200 renewable energy something. So I think so US need to have the way to stabilize electricity. Then of course the battery will be the key option. Therefore, I'm very wondering how the US or the industry or the government is having a discussion there how to install the battery storage at the same time the discussion with the new energy penetration. Thank you. Let me know if you have any information.
I believe that, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but, to my understanding now in the United States, I don't know whether it's a US specific or specific to California or entire United States, but if you want to build a large-scale solar or wind farm, you have to have a corresponding size of storage unit, grid-scale storage accompanied with that. And I think that, currently almost all the batteries that are installed at a grid level, grid scale is lithium batteries, but there is ongoing research going on. I think there was, last year, first, commercial or batch scale flow battery being tested at a grid level. So probably Brian, our battery expert, can shed some light on that.
Yeah. So as far as the question goes, of whether storage batteries to stabilize renewable energy is being discussed, that's also very regionally dependent. The regions of the US that are heavily discussing storage are ones that have set a very deep decarbonizing goal. So say, for example, California has that 100% zero carbon by 2045, right? And in doing the official planning exercises for that, they are trying to figure out how much, say, lithium ion batteries, how much long duration storage they're looking to deploy, right? So I would say that in the US, renewable energy deployment sort of took off ahead of storage, but now storage is being considered for regions that have a long-term goal to integrate a lot of renewable energy resources. However, there are a lot of regions of the US that don't have such a goal, right? So there's kind of two different appeals of storage. From an environmental standpoint, it's the integration of renewables, but another way to sort of incentivize people to install storage has to do with things that don't necessarily have to do with renewables, but more about grid resilience and things like that, right? So if you look at Texas, right, a lot of the way you sell storage to people in Texas has a lot to do with, well, you have outages, and if you install batteries, you won't have outages. And then if you install the battery anyway, we can pay you to operate it to support the grid or things like that. So as far as whether it's being discussed, it is, but same thing, it's very regionally dependent.
Great.
Yeah, I'd like to second the regional dependence that, what capabilities a region has is very different everywhere in the world. And so this is why you see the dramatic differences in types of carbon emitting or carbon-free energy all across the world. Some places had a very easy time getting to carbon-free. Some had to work a bit at it. And a lot of people are struggling because the costs of doing storage or building out transmission are things that are not to be undertaken lightly.
Yeah. Seems that all complex problems are, problems of space and time. Okay, so with that, I really thank you, all the panelists and all the participants to this panel. I really learned a lot personally, and I thought that the development that are going on, presented by our panel members, is very exciting, and it really presents an opportunity for us to really learn from each other and really develop something really interesting and important for our society and community. So again, thank you, everyone. I would like to ask you to give a kind of a virtual round of applause to our panelists. Thank you for your contribution. I would like to again thank you everyone for your patience and participation, especially to all of our panel members. Thank you everyone. I hope to see you again soon.